May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Well, today, this message is going to be the final message in a series of sermons from the Gospel of John, in which we're examining some encounters that different people have with Jesus and the impact of those encounters on them, and also the faith lessons that those stories bring to us. 3 weeks ago, we talked about the story of Jesus and Nicodemus. And in that story, Jesus told Nicodemus that you must be born from above. You must be born again. And he compared the work of the Holy Spirit to the wind that blows and talked about how we need to have God's Spirit come and reside within us. The following week, we considered the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. And we talked about how Jesus used that metaphor of water and how there was sort of a play on that word. Sometimes he was talking about physical water, but then Jesus used that to talk about how he gives us living water to satisfy our spiritual thirst. Then last week, we considered the story of the blind man whom Jesus healed. And in that story, Jesus used yet another analogy of light and says, I am the light of the world. And then there was this interplay between how Jesus healed the physical sight of the blind man, but also how he opens our spiritual eyes and gives us light to see him, to come to know the living God. Today, we're going to consider the story that we heard just a moment ago of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And what I want to do is just kind of walk through this story, and then as we walk through the story, kind of look at what John is doing with the story, and then make some application to it in our own lives. Well, the story features three of Jesus' closest friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And they were siblings, brothers and sisters. And they lived together in a town called Bethany, just 2 miles from Jerusalem. In fact, it's right on the other side of the Mount of Olives, where Jesus ascended, where the Garden of Gethsemane is. It's just a short walk around the mountain or over the mountain, and you're right into the city of Jerusalem there. Jesus and his disciples frequently stayed with this family when they came to Jerusalem to worship at the various festivals. You may remember another story, the story of Mary and Martha, where Jesus and his disciples are there, and Martha's all in a flurry, to preparing the food and making all the arrangements for all the guests, and she gets upset at Mary because Mary's just sitting there listening to Jesus. And remember that delightful story in the Gospels? This is the same Martha and Mary, but here we're also introduced to their brother Lazarus. And in this story, Lazarus dies. And John begins the story by saying that this family was especially dear to him. He had a close and intimate relationship with them. And when the story begins, Lazarus has fallen ill. And it's so serious that his sisters send for Jesus. Jesus is not in the area. In fact, I think John has said in the previous chapter, he's beyond the Jordan River, some distance from Jerusalem, so they have to send for him. There's a bit of a journey there that's involved in that. And of course, they're worried because they fear that he's sick unto death. And yet, when Jesus gets word that Lazarus is ill and they've sent for him, he waits 2 full days before he even begins the journey to Bethany. And by the time he gets there, Lazarus has already died, and he's already been in the grave for 4 days. And the mourners have gathered. And then word came to Mary and Martha that Jesus had arrived and that he was coming to see them. But I think Jesus remained outside the city. But at this point in Jesus' ministry, everywhere he went, there were throngs. He didn't want to come into the midst of that and add to the chaos of the event. So he sent word that he was there for them to come out and meet him kind of on the outskirts of the town. And what follows then is the interaction that Jesus has with Martha and then subsequently with Mary. And when we look at these two interactions, we find some similarities and we find some differences. And I want to look at them, those two things, because they teach us some really important lessons. Well, what's similar is, of course, that Martha and Mary were both grieving the loss of their brother. And I think they were also feeling disappointed in Jesus. First thing Martha says when she comes to Jesus is, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Can you hear the disappointment in that? And when Mary came to him a little bit later on, she says the very same thing. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." They're disappointed. They're disappointed in Jesus. Perhaps. Maybe confused. "I don't understand. Jesus, why did this happen? I thought you loved me." Might have even been angry at Jesus a little bit. And then on top of that, they might have felt guilty for feeling angry. And all those emotions are probably swirling around with them. I think those kind of emotions can flow through us whenever we're experiencing any type of grief. Grief is a natural process, one that we all walk through when we suffer any kind of loss. It can be the loss of a loved one, like here with Lazarus, but really any kind of loss can bring us to a place where we are walking a path of grief. And I want to say this: there is nothing wrong with going through a period of grief. It's natural, it's healthy, it's God-given. But it's hard and it's painful. We experience grief whenever there is some kind of loss in our life, but it can also be not just the loss of a loved one, it can be the loss of a job, it can be a broken relationship, it can be a change of life in life. When we move from one season of our life to another season of our life, we leave something behind. And we might not understand it, but suddenly we feel like we realize we're grieving something we've left behind. I remember when we took our son to college for the first time. He was our oldest, and we took him up to Furman, and we were all excited our son was going to college, and we unloaded the car, and we got him in his dorm room, which for me, he went to the same college I went to. He was in the same dorm I was in, so it was really like deja vu for me. As I was unpacking him, it was a time warp. I felt like I was going to college. But we got him all unpacked, and then we got in the car, and Kay just broke down and cried. And of course, then I broke down and cried. And we sat there in the car for a while just crying. But this was really a good thing. It was a necessary thing for him to go to college, but it also represented that we were losing something because he was entering a new phase in his life, and that old phase was gone. And we weren't going to get it back with him. We couldn't get it back. So we grieved that loss, even at the same time we were welcoming the new thing. So grief is very interesting in that way. I saw a funny commercial on TV years ago about the sending off of a young one to college, and you may have seen it, but the son is getting into his car. He's got his car all packed, and you look in there, and they've given him the TV, and they've given him the stereo, and all the electronics. He's here, put this in there, and they're just giving him all of this stuff, and they're weeping, and he's he's just flabbergasted that they're just giving him all the household electronics as he heads off to college. And he drives off, and they're going like this, and he goes around the corner. And then they open the garage door, and here's the new TV and the new stereo, and they're fixing to move it all in there. And he didn't realize that they just given him all the old stuff, and now here's all the new stuff. It was a great commercial. It was really funny, but it played on that commercial played on that experience of grief, which is very real, that we go through at times. At times like that. I love that commercial. I thought it was so funny. Well, this is what Martha and Mary were going through, and apparently others were going through the same thing there, because John tells us that some of the other people there were, when they saw Jesus, they said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" They were having the same questions as well. Well, let's consider the differences now between Martha and Mary. When we look at how the story unfolds, we can see that Martha and Mary handled their grief very differently. It's really true. Everyone handles grief in their own way. Sometimes it's a short period, sometimes it's a long period. There are no rules around that. But one of the main things we can take from this story is that God does not leave us alone in our grief and in our sorrow. And this is what we see here, because Jesus ministers to Martha and he ministers to Mary differently. So when they hear Jesus is there, Martha immediately runs out to Jesus to have a word with him. But Mary stays home. She won't come out. She stays in the house. Martha, the extrovert, went out to talk it out with Jesus, and Mary, who finally comes out there, falls at his feet. Martha needs to talk it out. Mary is just overcome with her sorrow. Well, let's look at how Jesus ministered to them. When Martha came out, she began talking about her grief and sorrow, so Jesus ministered to her by talking it out with her. When Mary came, Jesus ministered to her by weeping himself. That's when the Bible tells us that Jesus wept. He just simply entered into the sorrow with her and was with her in it. He didn't say anything. He just wept with her. Jesus brings comfort to us by entering into our sorrow. Isaiah called him the man of sorrows. And he says, surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrow. So in our sorrow, we can draw near to him, and he will draw near to us. Well, when Martha came to Jesus, she said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And of course, we hear that disappointment there. But then she also expresses her faith, because she turns right around and says, yet I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. See, for Martha, her disappointment and her sorrow and her grief was all mixed up with her faith. It's just all kind of jumbled up in there for her. Well, when Jesus begins to talk to her, he speaks to her on the basis of that statement of faith that she offered. He turns to her and he says, your brother will rise again. Now this is a little bit ambivalent. Now Jesus, on the one hand, Jesus has already told his disciples that he intends to raise him. So Jesus already knows what he's going to do here. But Martha doesn't know that. So Martha says, yes, I know that he will be raised up on the last day. She's talking about the resurrection at the end of the age. Yes, as we have in the creed, it's like she was affirming that article of faith that they even had back then. Yes, I know that he will be raised at the end of the age. And that's when Jesus turned to her and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And here again, like these other stories in John, we see that Jesus is taking these articles of faith, these pictures that we have in the Old Testament that were being lived out among the people of God, and Jesus has come to say, I am the fulfillment of that hope. I am the fulfillment of that. I am the resurrection. He's inviting her to put her faith in Him. In Him. Personally. You have the hope of Israel. Trust me. I am the fulfillment of that hope. The hope of Israel. This is what he's saying to her. In the midst of Martha's sorrow and grief, in the midst of her disappointment and her confusion, she hears these words and she says to Jesus, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. So with those two things, that Jesus' assertion, I am the resurrection, her question to her, do you believe this? And her answer, her confession of faith in Jesus becomes the heart of this story, the very heart. It's actually more the heart of the story than the actual raising of Lazarus. It's because it's showing the heart of faith that Martha has in Jesus. So let's now turn, we looked at the heart of the story, let's look at the climax of the story. They took Jesus to the gravesite, and John tells us that Jesus was deeply moved. See, he's still entering into their sorrow, even though he knows what he's about to do. He tells them to roll away the gravestone. And then he prays out loud for all to hear. And he says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And then he turned his attention to the tomb and he said, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus appears at the grave opening. Can you imagine the crowd? You know, they rolled that stone away. Lazarus come forth, and then out of the shadows comes this figure, still wrapped in the grave clothes. And Jesus turns to them and says, free him from his grave clothes and let him go. You know, Jesus said that he raised Lazarus from the dead so that they would believe that God had sent him. He raised Lazarus from the dead so that we would believe it, that he sent him. He raised Lazarus from the dead to show and demonstrate that he is the resurrection and the life. He had said it, now he was demonstrating it. And the event occurred about a month before Jesus' own death and resurrection. Jesus himself then was crucified, and he was laid in a tomb. He was laid in a tomb for Lazarus. He was laid in the tomb for us. Laid in the tomb and then risen from the dead himself. And I'm convinced that part of the reason why Jesus raised Lazarus was so that when he himself was raised from the dead, we would know that that was for us, not just for him. Makes sense that God would raise Jesus from the dead. He was sinless. But he raised Lazarus from the dead to demonstrate that his resurrection impacts us. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, even though he dies, yet he shall live. And he gives us that hope. You know, in a way, Jesus he resolved for Martha and Mary at that point when he raised him, he resolved any reason for them to grieve. He certainly turned their mourning into gladness. But what about us? Because, we have loved ones that go on, and Jesus doesn't raise them right away. But he does, with this event, give us a picture of what will be. Because there's a very important distinction that we need to make. There is a big difference between grieving, which is healthy and good, and something we all need to do at times of loss. There's a big distinction between that and despair. Despair means I have no hope. But with this picture of the raising of Lazarus, Jesus gives us, you imagine the celebration. John 12, there's a feast and a celebration. The story really goes on into John chapter 12. There's a celebration there, which is a picture of what's to come. And that's the hope that we have. See, he gives us in the raising of Lazarus and in his own raising the hope and the expectation that even though we may die and even though loved ones may die, we know that that's not the end. There's no despair in God's kingdom. There's grieving, but no despair. He heals us from that despair. So, let me close by considering Mary now. I've kind of held her to the last. Here, I want to put my attention back on her. You remember when they heard that when Martha and Mary heard that Jesus was there, Martha runs out there. Mary stays in the house. She's sorrowful, confused, disappointed, hurt. It's like she was as wrapped up in the grave clothes of those things as Lazarus was wrapped up in his grave clothes in the tomb. She had put herself in a tomb with her own despairing. See, Lazarus is not the only one whom Jesus raised that day. He sends word back through Martha to Mary, who goes to Mary and says, "The Master is asking for you." He is calling Mary out from where she was hidden away. And then she runs out to meet Jesus. And Jesus enters into her sorrow with her and ministers his comfort and his peace to her heart. Lazarus was not the only one raised that day. So in the story of Lazarus, Jesus enters into the grief process with us. He shows us that he comes to us in our grief, ministers to us, but he delivers us from despair. Well, how can we come to him? When Martha and Mary, Jesus came and said, he's out there, you could go out there. To me, I think the best way that God has provided for us to come to him is right here at the table. Because he's left us the communion of bread and wine, his body and blood, that we can come to the table. We can come to him, and we can bring, if our hearts are sorrowful, if we're walking in grief, or even if everything's going great and we're just rejoicing, we can come to him, and he meets us there. He meets us in a way that's individual to each one of us. And yet he at the same time meets us together at the table. He is present. His presence, his real presence, comes to us as we open our hearts and as we take the same step Martha did and say in our own hearts, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, who is to come into the world." With that faith, Jesus can minister his comfort and his peace to our hearts. And I want to encourage us as we come to the table today to come in that way. Come in faith. Come to receive, for he is here to impart his grace to you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. that tree, it would break the chains of sin's captivity. Love grew where the blood fell. Flowers of hope sprang up for sin, men, and misery. Sin died where the blood fell. I'm so glad this precious blood covered thorns of violence and hate were growing wildly, and the sorrow they had caused was plain to see. But when the blood came streaming down that cross where my Jesus bled and died, he started blossoms of forgiveness flowing free. Oh, love grew where the blood fell. Flowers of hope sprang up for men